This is Polaris Live. I'm your host, Sarwar KASHMERI, inviting our viewers from around the world to this global series of conversations on the US-China relationship. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'm really pleased to tell you that my guest today is Ms. Meenakshi AHAMED, a freelance journalist who has written on American foreign policy in various magazines and publications: Foreign Policy, The Asian Age, The Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Seminar. She was a London correspondent for NDTV from 1989 to 1996. Meenakshi holds a postgraduate degree from the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, in Development, Economics, and Public Health. She's based in Washington, D.C. and New York City. Meenakshi has just published a really timely book. It's called A Matter of Trust: India-US Relations from Truman to Trump. It's by HarperCollins, and it talks about the 70 years of relationship between America and India, which is, of course, on the front pages today for very many reasons, including China. I want to read to you just one blurb from the cover of the book, which is by, and it's by Strobe Talbot, the former Deputy Secretary of State, who says, Meenakshi AHAMED has brilliantly combined her talent as an accomplished journalist with her assiduous historical research to tell the tale of two great democracies. She brings to life the leaders in both countries with their views and prejudices. A masterpiece, Mr. Talbot says. And with that, let me bring Ms. Meenakshi on to Polaris Live. Good morning, Ms. Meenakshi AHAMED. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. And thank you for having me on your show.
Is everybody in the capital of the world, Washington, D.C., doing well and peacefully?
They are. It's a very competent government that we have here.
Indeed. So listen, Meenakshi, can you hold up your book? I want to show that to everybody. That is such a graphically wonderful cover. So it's A Matter of Trust: India-US Relations from Truman to Trump.
Indeed.
Fantastic. How long? That's fine. I just wanted to show that. How long did it take you to write this book?
About 10 years.
Wow.
Well, it took me a long time because I had to do research in India and here, and I decided to go to almost all the presidential libraries that I could. The book is divided by US presidents, and so each presidential library has its own character. And when you sit in them and you work there and you go through all the original documents and papers and correspondence, you get a sense of the president, and you get a sense of their character. And sitting in the library, you sort of feel you can imbibe who they were as a person. And so it took time to go through all that material. And I also wanted to go through the memoirs and diaries, etc. So it just really took a long time to plow through all that.
Well, I bet you really enjoyed writing the book, because I can tell from your face as you're talking about the book that you look so happy and accomplished. But what I wanted to ask you is, I've been dying to ask you this actually, is has the India-US relationship gone in cycles? Is there a theme that recurs? I mean, I recall from growing up in India, there was always this deep skepticism, Meena, of aligning with the West because of the colonial, non-aligned path. So is there a theme that reemerges over and over again on there? I'm just going to, no, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think There have been many ups and downs in the relationship.
Right.
I prefer to put it as ups and downs. In the early years, there was a great deal of suspicion between the two countries, partly because of exactly what you mentioned. India chose the path of non-alignment.
Right.
Now you have to, if you remember, when India became independent, India emerged as an independent country when the world had come out of World War II. And these two power blocks had emerged, the Western power bloc with the US as the leader, and then the Communist power bloc with the Soviet Union as the leader.
Yes.
And and the Cold War had descended across the Western Hemisphere and really across the world. And so the US wanted everyone to choose sides. If you remember, the Truman Doctrine was all about the containment of communism. So India at that point had just thrown off a colonial power, and everyone in the country was united behind neutrality. So they had no intention of taking on or allowing another power to dominate the country. So they were very committed to non-alignment, and that really did not sit well with the West. Certainly not well with Washington. So uh, that became a rub. That became an irritant in Washington. So in my book, I described Truman, for example, who was convinced that Nehru was a communist. And it created a great deal of friction between them. When his friend Justice Douglas, who was a member of the Supreme Court, every summer he would go to a different country. And one summer he was going to India, and he calls Justice Douglas in to see him. And Truman says to Douglas, when you go to India, I want you to go and see Nehru. And that man is a communist. And, he's a communist if I ever saw one. He sat in that chair where you're sitting, and I can smell these communists a mile away. And, if I ever saw a communist, Nehru was a communist. And so Douglas goes to India, and he spends all this time with Nehru. He has dinners with him, lunches with him, takes walks with him. And he has wonderful conversations because Nehru was a very erudite man. And he comes back, and so Truman says, "Well, what do you think?" And he says, "Well, sir, Nehru's no more a communist than you or I," and he just explodes. I mean, just Truman refuses to believe that, and Douglas writes in his memoirs, and I found these buried somewhere in the Princeton archives. Douglas says that basically. I'm assuming that's your phone, not mine.
Keep going, Meenakshi.
So Douglas says that basically it was like shouting into a hurricane, and there was no way that you were ever going to convince someone like someone like Truman, who came from a small town in Independence, Missouri, that Nehru, who was this worldly man, had come up with a policy that was good for his country. So there was this friction, there was a cultural difference. And so the policy of non-alignment that you brought up created friction. And it continued under Eisenhower because John Foster Dulles, for him, it was a moral issue. He saw everything through a moral lens.
Yes.
And it was communism versus, Christianity, etc. So he also continued this this sort of, he took an anti-Indian stand because he just thought Nehru's policy was immoral. So it wasn't really until Dulles passed away that and Eisenhower reached out to Nehru. They actually came to a mutual understanding, and they developed some trust over the Suez crisis. They found themselves on the same side, that they developed an understanding, and then Nehru came to Gettysburg and had a wonderful evening with Eisenhower, and the relationship sort of settled, and they came to an accommodation, and they appreciated each other. But it was at the end of Eisenhower's term. And Eisenhower made a visit to India that was really very successful. And then came Kennedy, who was very pro-India. But as we all know, Kennedy was
Indeed.
assassinated, and Nehru died shortly afterwards. So there were many ups and downs. Now, unfortunately, after, just as things started to improve with Kennedy, etc., you had Mrs. Gandhi and Nixon and Johnson, and oh my goodness, the relationship could not have been worse. I mean, it completely deteriorated with those people, and so some of it was policy, but a lot of it was personality. So, that had less to do with non-alignment, more to do with Nixon's push to go to China at the time,
Right.
and his and the circumstances of what was going on, the inconvenient fact of Pakistan being the conduit and a civil war taking place in Pakistan, and Nixon and Kissinger ignoring the fact, and Mrs. Gandhi getting involved and basically besting the Pakistani army and the side. So and there was, I'm sure you've seen, and the public has seen now, all the tapes that have become available, the Nixon tapes that are infamous, where he states how he physically couldn't stand Mrs. Gandhi. They couldn't, he could not bear to be in the same room as her. They just couldn't stand each other.
Let me interrupt you for a second. And by the way, I apologize for those phone calls. Usually, when my producer calls, I fear that there might be something happening on our program, but there was no real message. So, but I apologize. That's the only call I take on these programs, Meenakshi. But what I wanted to ask you, this is, you've painted quite a picture, and I can see why it took such a long time, because of all the research that you had to do on each one of the presidents, but also each one of the Indian prime ministers as it went along. But what I wanted to ask you is, here we are. Here we are with the US and India seemingly joining hands to counter China in this group called Quad. Right? That includes the US, Japan, Australia, India. Do you think that this wave that you've described is at a stage now where the US can really count on India to join the Western strategic competition with China? How do you think this fits into the picture and the graph that you've painted, Meenakshi?
Well, I think what is interesting about my book, and I think why it may be important for people to read, is to show the trajectory of how the relationship went from all those years of ups and downs, and then a real deterioration under Mrs. Gandhi, and then how it changed. And the big change really took place in the 90s after India went through this massive economic reform period and emerged as a powerful economy. And once India became an economic power and sort of got a seat at the global table, at the global high table, then it became a player and got the US's attention. And then the other factor was the growing wealth and influence of the Indian diaspora in the US, which I don't think you can underestimate its influence. So a lot of factors change, and now we're not a treaty ally, but we're just under a treaty partner, but we are very much an ally of the US. So will that change? I don't see it changing now, because I think India is now one of the global powers in the world. It has become an economic power. That is not going to change anytime soon. That's not going to go backwards. And I think what's interesting in the book, if you look at the book, India was not important strategically to the U.S. in the 50s or in the 40s, but it was important for one reason. It was considered a frontline state against communist Chinese expansion, against Chinese communist expansion. And when you look at it today, China is still the big reason why India, in a sense, is important strategically to the US.
But let me ask you, Meena, I'm interrupting you again, but Chinese investment in India, has been growing. It's almost doubled over the last 6 years. So how does that square with what's taking place? I mean, it seems to me that yes, India and China, that India has been the frontline state. But I mean, it's India and China are existing next to one another. There's this growing commercial relationship. And I mean, with this devastation of the Quad in India, I mean, isn't some experts are saying it will take a decade for India to recover from this? So, I mean, isn't the China-India relationship also hugely important for India?
Well, I think India has a bit of a dilemma right now. Look, there are many Chinese experts in India. Shiv Shankar Menon, Nirupama Rao, who's coming out with a book on China soon.
Yes.
Shiv Shankar Menon has just come out with a book about Asia and India. And Shyam Saran, who writes frequently about China, and all three were ambassadors there. There is no question that for India, China is a big trading partner, but also China sits on India's border. I don't think that the policy of India's policy of non-alignment has never before been as important as it is now. Now, Modi has gone out of his way. Prime Minister Modi has gone out of his way to make his friendship with the U.S. the cornerstone of his foreign policy. He's gone out of his way to court President Obama on the climate deal. He's gone out of his way to, court President Trump, and presumably he will go out of his way to be friends with President Biden. He certainly was very positive when Biden reached out to him over the Quad. Now, he wasn't able to, I don't think he's going to be able to fulfill India's promises on the vaccines, which was one of the points that they had raised during the Quad negotiations, because obviously the pandemic has devastated India, as you said. And India needs all the vaccines that it manufactures for its own needs. However, the Quad, I think the Quad is, a lot of people have said the Quad is now a new alternative to NATO. I'm not sure that the Quad has developed enough to provide that sort of an alliance. I think it's still very early days. I think India has to worry about one thing, which is China sits on its border. And
Right.
I think the recent border clashes, I think the Chinese have made it very clear to India that you might be making friends with the U.S. and developing a close relationship with them, but just remember who's on your border. We have the ability to hurt you, and I don't think the U.S. is going to come rescue you.
Yes, that's
So I think that India has to tread quite carefully.
indeed. But I want to cycle back to your book. There are a couple of questions I have. But do you think that the Indians really believe that the U.S. military will come to their aid should China attack in the Himalayas? What do you think? I know no one can really know, but if you were to blue sky with me on that, what would you say?
So let's look at Afghanistan as an example.
Yes.
Recently, the U.S. Made a decision to pull out of Afghanistan. They only had 2,500 troops there. And if there's been a lot of talk in Washington, if you talk to people in Washington on both sides of the aisle, there were several people who were against the decision, who are Afghan watchers in Washington, who felt that the cost of keeping 2,500 people in Afghanistan was so minimal that it cost the US military so little. I mean, when you look at how many losses of lives there are to the military just on a regular basis due to accidents, it's maybe like around 50 a year. And the amount of people that die in Afghanistan in the US military is far less than that.
Right.
And the cost of keeping 2,500 troops there is just pocket change for the US. So why pull out? Because as long as you have a presence there, it's sort of an intimidation factor for the Taliban. Once you remove them, in a sense, you're basically, it's the message you're sending out to the Afghan people that you're basically, giving up on them, and the message you're sending to the Taliban that it's yours to take in a way. And so a lot of people who were against this move, argued that it cost so little that the message you're sending was all wrong. And why has Biden done this? Because actually you don't need a presence, because these days with drone missiles, you can do a lot just in Washington. You can send drone missiles, you can do air support, and you can provide a lot of cover long distance. You don't actually need a vast army on the ground.
But let me ask you again. I need
so when
to
you ask about India, so similarly, the question is, could the U.S. provide support to the Indians?
No, that's not what I was asking. I mean, I know they can. I'm just asking if India, you think, feels confident that if there's an attack by the Chinese, the American military will come to India's aid. That specifically was, I wondered what your thinking is.
Well, I'm not sure that the Indians would ask for the Americans to come to, I don't think the Indians would ask the American military. I mean, what sort of aid? I mean, that's questionable. In the past, they've never allowed boots on the ground. Are you talking about equipment? I mean, they're already.
Well, my understanding of the military situation between India and China is that China will overwhelm India within 48 hours. That's some of the thinking in American think tanks and the models that the American military runs on its computers. So, but it's a really hypothetical question, and I apologize for asking for it, because I did want to. Meenakshi,
Fear.
Sorry,
I think
go ahead.
For me, the greater issue is not the military. I think China has shown that there are other ways that they can hurt India. For example, turning off the electrical grid. I mean, they've shown that they've penetrated India's electrical grid. That's much more scary. That's much more threatening. They have been building, the water supply, for example, all the rivers, the mouth of all the rivers, the sources are all way up, high up in the mountains in the Himalayas near Tibet, and they have been building all kinds of access points there. And frankly, I think they have access to all that, and I think they could threaten India's water supply in a way that would be much more serious than anything that you could imagine.
That's well put.
so I think that that the military the military aspect to me is sort of not as important or critical, because that seems a bit ham-fisted and not really what I think the Chinese would do. Yeah, if they wanted to, they could walk across the border, and they have a superior ability there. I think the Chinese have sent messages already, by in small ways, that we that our cybersecurity forces, I mean, their cybersecurity capability is so superior now. I mean, they've got so many universities devoted just to cybersecurity. They want to dominate cybersecurity by 2030.
Yes, absolutely. Listen, I want to go back to your book. And there's a point there that I forgot to ask you. That is, Mr. Modi has changed, the relationship almost between India and the US. And he seems to be so easily able to befriend people with diametrically opposed thinking in America, as Mr. Biden, as Mr. Trump. I mean, he seems to be a master of striking relationships. And how do you give credit for it? I thought in the remaining time we have, we might just talk about that special idea.
I think he has been very successful at cultivating the US presidents. I think one of the things that he decided, probably early on, was that being friends with the US was going to be his big, foreign policy. It's going to be the cornerstone of his foreign policy strategy. And so, because I asked Jake Sullivan at one point, who's now the National Security Advisor, how is it that, um, that President Obama got along with someone as different as Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and Prime Minister Modi? They're so different. They're different in their beliefs, their value systems. And his answer was that, look, when by the time President Obama came into office, he appreciated Prime Minister Manmohan Singh intellectually, but Manmohan Singh by that time was caught up with all the internal scandals that had afflicted the Congress Party, and the Congress Party had frankly lost altitude, and they were, or there were all those corruption scandals, and they just didn't have the necessary coalition domestically to get anything done. And so there was sort of a lack of energy, if you may want to put it for a better phrase. And President Obama, he had a lot on his agenda. He wanted to get things done. And when Modi came in, he came in with a landslide. He was energetic. And President Obama felt, well, this is a man I can work with and we can accomplish something. And, Modi at that time, sort of hid his Hindutva agenda. He kind of kept it on the back burner, and he went all out to present himself as someone who was progressive, and he went out of his way to be a partner on climate change. And so President Obama felt this was someone I can actually accomplish something with, and he was very grateful because President Obama wanted to leave this legacy on climate change. And so they worked very well together. They had several meetings, and I think Prime Minister Modi worked really hard to get to work with President Obama on this. So I think he appreciated that. Now, a lot of these were the early days of Modi. Now, when President Obama left and President Trump came, two things happened. I think one, President Trump made it very clear he didn't really care about people's domestic agendas and countries. He didn't care about human rights, etc. So Modi was unfettered and unencumbered. And
Right.
so I think he was able to pursue, his domestic agenda without feeling that he was going to be censured in any way.
Yep.
Whereas President Obama, when he came to India and he made that speech in Shreveport, he made very specific references to having to, don't forget, take care of minorities, equality, and all that. So I think there was some sort of amount of messaging that came from the White House about expectations of human rights, etc. So, so I think Prime Minister Modi definitely went out of his way to please President Obama. And when it came to Trump, he had figured out Trump. He figured out what made him happy. Crowds made him happy. And size and superficial things. And he decided the way to make this man happy was to present him with a huge crowd.
Well,
and he catered to that. He went to the lowest common denominator. And he, listen, they didn't agree on everything. But, obviously Trump had this whole agenda of, what's good for America and, trade, bilateral issues on trade. And, he sort of insisted that India part with its, the medicines that were hydroxychloroquine and all that stuff. So he put pressure on Modi for that. Modi caved. And not happily, I don't think.
yes,
but he did what he had to placate Trump. But he was clever. He was very clever with managing his relationships. Now, when Biden came in, he's let's see how it's very early days as yet. They've been hit by a pandemic, so I think the whole world just wants to help India right now.
Yes, let me, I need to interrupt again. We are running over time, but I do want you to end with a very short, less than a minute question, please, which is, if you found yourself alone with President Biden, what advice would you give him, India and China? Just half a minute or so.
Well, I would have things to say to him about India.
Yes.
I'm not sure about India and China.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Could tell him.
What would you say?
Well, I think I would like to tell him that I would like to remind him not to forget about human rights.
Ah, okay. Well said. Ms. Meenakshi AHAMED, author of this wonderful book on U.S.-China relations over 70 years. I thank you for coming on Polaris Live and for letting our viewers take a look at who you are, your views, your book, and we are in your debt. So thank you, Meena.
Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. So at this point, I'd like to remind you that this is Polaris Live. Next week is a weekend week, so Polaris Live will take a holiday next Tuesday, but we will return after that. Please check my website, kashmiri.com, to see the lineup of guests in July. Hope to see you again then and frequently after that. Until then, goodbye.